Francis, should we start the animation now?
Sure, we'll show the animation and we'll start. Thank you very much, Penny. Eamon, can you display the animation, please? Thank you very much.
How can we know the current status, trends, and likely futures of our coral reefs with certainty? Prior to 1998, the global average hard coral cover on the world's coral reefs was high and stable. But a single mass coral bleaching event killed 8% of the world's coral. Coral cover recovered during the next decade until a succession of large-scale bleaching events killed 14% of the world's coral. Coral reefs simply hadn't the time between bleaching events to recover. As a consequence, the global average cover of algae on the world's coral reefs has increased by 20%. Algal dominance reduces the ability of corals and the marine life they support to re-establish themselves. It's time to step up our efforts to protect and restore our coral reefs. To help communities, businesses, and governments conserve and manage our vital coral reefs, the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network has released a new report examining the status and trends of the world's coral reefs. Several hundred scientists and organizations contributed to this report, which is based on a global dataset of almost 2 million observations from over 12,000 sites in 73 countries. Now, in the first global report since 2008, you can discover the status, trends, and likely futures of your coral reefs to help you make a positive difference. To learn more and read the report, visit www.gcrmn.net. How can we know the current status,
Thank you very much.
and likely futures?
Sorry about the little hiccup at the beginning. Good morning, bonjour, good evening, bonsoir, and welcome, bienvenue, bienvenidas, to this eagerly anticipated and long-awaited launch event. My name's Penny Wensley. I'm the chairman of the Australian Institute of Marine Science Council and also of the Great Barrier Reef Advisory Committee. I'm also a former Australian ambassador for the environment who was involved with the establishment of ICRI and the GCRMN. As has become customary in our country, I acknowledge Australia's Indigenous peoples as the traditional owners of the lands and the waters of our ancient island continent, and acknowledge in particular the truly rich heritage, which is now shared by all Australians, of being custodians of what is the world's oldest continuous living culture. It's a great pleasure to be moderator of these proceedings, which are going to offer 2 overview presentations on the report and then 5 regional reports, followed, we hope, by a short time for questions using the Q&A function. We've got a very large number of attendees, which is terrific. So obviously not all questions are going to be able to be answered during the session, but any that are not able to be addressed, I can assure you will receive a reply by email after the event. Before introducing the first speaker, I extend my own warm congratulations and appreciation to everyone involved with the reactivation, the reanimation of the GCRMN and with the production of this report. As the pressures on the world's coral reefs have grown, and as policy and decision makers and managers and reef communities around the world have been struggling to respond, the need for a comprehensive, authoritative, evidence-based assessment of the status of coral reefs worldwide has become ever more pressing. And now, at last, after a gap of 12 years, we have it. Thanks to ICRI and the governments and the organisations that support it. Thanks to the monumental, David's favourite word, I think it's Herculean effort of hundreds of individuals who have committed thousands of hours to its preparation. It is, quite simply, the largest analysis of coral reef health ever undertaken. To tell you about the report, the 6th Status of Coral Reefs of the World Report 2020, we have a group of people who are going to give the global and regional results and the key messages. So let's turn now to the presenters and the experts, beginning with Jeremy Wicker, who will tell us about the methods. Jeremy's a PhD student affiliated to CRIOB, a French laboratory that many of you will know well, based in France and French Polynesia. His work focuses on temporal trends, disturbance and resilience of coral reefs, and he was responsible for data gathering and also, importantly, data integration. And he's going to talk to us about that and tell us something a bit more about the exciting subject of data homogenization. Over to you, Jeremy. Vous avez la parole.
Thank you for this introduction. Can you see my screen? Perfect. So yes, I will speak about the method section of the report, which is divided in 2 main parts, the data integration on one hand and the data analysis on the other hand. So first, the data integration. At the beginning of the report, as we wanted to produce quantitative estimates of coral cover and algae cover at the global scale, it was necessary to get data. So for that purpose, we launched a call to contribution to gather raw data on bounty cover in coral reef. And we organized 5 workshops in different places in the world to discuss with collaborators and to increase the visibility of our project. Then we signed data sharing agreements with most of data contributors, and we received a lot of different datasets. However, the datasets we received were very heterogeneous in terms of format or structure. It was therefore necessary to pass through a step called data integration to obtain a homogeneous unique dataset that will then be used for the data analysis. So the data integration is a process of combining multiple data objects into a single unified data object. So for that purpose, we designed a 4-step data integration workflow. We first gathering data from data contributors. Then we individually reformat their datasets to obtain a consistent format. Then we group all these different datasets and we apply a taxonomic assignment. And finally, we use a step called QA/QC for quality assurance and quality control in order to check if there is any errors and to correct them if it's the case. So using this approach, we were able to create a global database. This database is built on the contribution of more than 300 people all around the world. This represents 250 datasets integrated and 12,000 sites all around the world, as you can see on this map. This represents around 40 years of data and around 2 million of observations. With this global dataset, it was then possible to perform the data analysis. However, we face two main challenges here. First, the sampling effort is not homogeneous at the global scale. For example, in the South Florida is characterized by a greater number of monitoring sites than some remote islands in the Pacific. And it was necessary to take this into account to avoid that some region have too much weight in the global trends obtained. Second, the coral reef surface is not evenly distributed at the global scale. For example, the coral triangle represents a greater proportion of coral reef surface than the Eastern tropical Pacific, for example. And to overcome these two challenges, we choose to use a hierarchical Bayesian model. So how does this model works? First, it's based on the global database we built. Those I presented previously with the data integration. Then we use the coral reef surfaces as weight. And finally, we use the intermediate spatial scales, such as the marine ecoregion of the world or the regions defined by the GCRMN as the hierarchy. This approach has made possible to propagate the trends from local scale to upper spatial scales by taking into account both the differences in the sampling effort and the differences in coral reef surfaces. This hierarchical Bayesian model was also very interesting because it allowed us to obtain the uncertainties around the trends surfaces observed, and not only the trends, and this was important for the interpretation of the result. So that's the end of this brief description of the method we used. Thank you for your attention, and many thanks to all data contributors.
Merci, Jeremy. So the next speaker on our list is David Suter. Dr. David Suter is the Chief Research Officer at a place close to my heart, the Australian Institute of Marine Science, AIMS, but very importantly is the global coordinator of the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. David's been involved with coral reef research and tropical coastal ecosystems management pretty much all over the world: Australia, East Africa, the Indian Ocean Islands, South and Southeast Asia, working through the World Bank and UNEP and CEDA and on USAID funded programs. His current role involves the collaborative development of long-term strategic research directions for AIMS and terrific, the reinvigoration of the GCRMN. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Penny. A impressive introduction. I hope I'm able to do it justice. Okay, so I'm a bit concerned that what you're seeing is not my presentation. So let's try this. How's that? Nothing yet? No.
We could see it. It just wasn't in presenter mode, I think, David.
Oh, okay.
You could sort of see the notes at the bottom.
Yep, that's fine. Let's kick off properly. Now, it looked odd on my computer more than anything. Okay, thank you very much, Penny. I will actually try and do the little animation that kicked off this session justice. I absolutely have to thank a crowd in Canberra called Redboat who did that animation for us. Obviously, we helped with the script, but they were the creative geniuses behind the imagery, and I think it does a remarkable job of summarising what I'll spend the next probably 15 or so minutes saying, and they've done it in one. So impressive. As Penny's said, it's my role, not only as Chief Research Officer at AIMS, but also as Global Coordinator of the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network to, well, it's my pleasure to present what has been a number of years in the making and an extraordinary effort by an extraordinary number of people. Before I actually kick off to the things that I'm sure everyone's really wanting to hear, I do have a number of organisations and people to thank. And in particular, as Jeremy has so articulately stated, we received contributions of data from more than 300 people around the world to accumulate this data set. And that is a true testament to the reach of the GCRMN and the level of support to the GCRMN. And to those people, I very much thank you for your voluntary contributions. In addition, we have 10 regional coordinators that assist with the coordination of the GCRMN. 5 of them will present later after me. 5 of them won't, but I would sincerely like to thank all of them for their efforts in the production of this report. A number of organisations gave significant funding. In particular, the Australian Government's Department of Foreign Affairs gave a substantial amount of money. The Principality of Monaco, the Government of Sweden, the Prince Albert II Foundation, and the United Nations Environment Programme all contributed both cash and in kind to the production of this report. So to those, I sincerely thank you for your contributions. I'd also like to thank ICRI. I'm sure many, if not all, everyone on the call recognises that the GCRMN is a subsidiary, if you like, or an action network within the International Coral Reef Initiative. The GCRMN essentially reports to the International Coral Reef Initiative, and it's one of the major audiences, if you like, for this particular report and all of ICRI's members. Finally, I'd like to thank the Australian Institute of Marine Science, who is the current host of the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. And AIMS, as we like to call it, has contributed enormously to this report. The skill sets that I've been able to draw on, particularly that very complicated analysis that Jeremy described. Murray Logan has, a brain the size of a planet, to be honest, and has done some amazing things with this particular report. So I won't spend much time on this because Jeremy articulated this very, very well in his presentation. What I will draw out of this, in addition to the magnitude of the task to producing a quantitative analysis, is the fact that this report is a departure from earlier GCRMN reports. Earlier GCRMN reports, and I'd like to acknowledge Clive Wilkinson here, were syntheses of a vast amount of information contributed by a vast number of people around the world. We've taken a different tack here on the advice of the GCRMN working group and those responsible for the reinvigoration, where we have focused particularly on a quantitative analysis of a global data set that Jeremy described. That has created some benefits, and it's also created some challenges. And I'll get to maybe some of the challenges right at the end. This, no doubt, is the graph that people have been wanting to see. This graph presents global average coral cover between 1978, when the first data were provided to this, or collected and provided to this analysis, and 2019. So data more recent than 2019 haven't been included because we stopped our data collection process at the end of 2019. So more recent trends we won't be able to report on. However, we do have almost 40 years worth of trends to report on here. Immediately, I think you'll be able to see some quite strong patterns in this trend graph. First, you have the period pre-1998, the first global bleaching event. Global average coral cover was quite high and quite stable, about 32%. However, because data were both sparse and also scarce in that period, the uncertainties around the estimate of global average coral cover are quite large. But then we had 1998, which was the first global mass bleaching event. And two things happened as a consequence of this event. The first was that we had an extraordinary increase in the number of surveys that were conducted. People mobilized all around the world to measure the impacts of the 98 bleaching event. And those surveys have progressively increased until about 2016 and 17. And I think you'd be able to see in that graph perhaps the impacts of other major events as well, particularly the 16-17 bleaching events. The second thing that happened as a consequence of all of these surveys was that we realized that that particular event alone killed 8% of the world's corals. That is a very, very large amount of coral. In fact, if you consider all the coral living in a number of the GCRMN regions, it actually exceeds that. Then we had a relatively benign period with very few major global disturbances, and coral cover actually recovered to pre-1998 levels. This is important, and it is an important point for coral reefs globally. This recovery and recovery later on is quite clear demonstration that when coral reefs do have the opportunity to recover, they retain their resilience and they can recover. However, in 2010 and then in 2016, we had the second and third major global bleaching event. The frequency of these bleaching events is increasing. We can see that. And as a consequence, we're also seeing substantial declines in global average coral cover. In fact, in that period alone, we lost 14% of the world's coral. And if you were to calculate that out, that's actually more coral that currently lives on all of Australia's reefs. So essentially removing that from the global coral pool, if you like. However, in 2019, we see the very first signs, if you like, of possible recovery. Now, we need to recognise that the amount of data that we received in 2019 was quite a lot smaller than in previous years, owing to the cutoff effect, if you like, of when we stopped. But it is quite clear that the global trend in coral cover kicks up in 2019. So that resilience of the world's coral reefs seems to still be there even now. So coral reefs is not lost. These two graphs present the cover of algae, the global average cover of algae, and how that compares to coral. So the ratio of coral to algae. By and large, the relationship is, or the pattern or the trend in algal cover is the inverse of coral cover. But you do see similar sort of patterns. Pre-2011, in fact, algal cover was quite constant and relatively low across the world's reefs, about 16%. And what we see is that during this time, there's more than twice as much coral on the world's reefs as there is algae. So the world's reefs, on average, are dominated by coral compared to algae. However, in the period after 2011, we see substantial increases in the amount of algae in the world's reefs. And in fact, by 2019, there was 20% more algae on the world's reefs. And as a consequence, you're seeing a change or a decrease in the ratio between coral and algae. In 2019, the ratio had dropped to 1.5. So in 2019, compared to say 2011, the ratio had gone from more than twice as much coral on the world's reefs to about 1.5 times as much. So we're approaching parity. As part of this analysis, we looked to explore the relationships between changes in global coral cover and major drivers of that change. Now, to get a significant change in the global coral cover or the average global coral cover, one of two things has to happen. Either you have lots of little events all acting in the same way simultaneously, which is perhaps a little unlikely, or you get a single major event. And this is what this essentially shows. So this graph is an overlay of global average coral cover, the blue line in the background, with the sea surface temperature anomaly for the last 40 odd years overlaid over the top. And you see some really striking patterns. And in fact, there are two elements that are striking in this. The first is the role of quite rapid increases. So everywhere where there's a dark red band here, you can see that there's associated with declines. So if we look at the three major bleaching events, 98, 2010, and 2016, we can see that each of those events coincides with a point where sea surface temperature anomalies are rapidly increasing. The second element that influences coral cover is this prolonged period of high sea temperatures effectively. Since essentially 2011, we've seen sea surface temperatures remain high. And there's fair evidence that situation has hindered coral recovery at a global scale. The last thing is to draw on the 2019 results again. You'll note that the sea temperature or the sea surface temperature anomaly remains high even in 2019, but we're seeing the first evidence of some recovery. It'd be really impressive and something worth looking into for the future to see if that is evidence of adaptation or community change in coral reefs in order to adapt to increasing temperatures. However, the scale of adaptation among corals in particular is yet to be seen and worth the subject of considerable research. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. They were the global results and the global patterns. You can see a clear relationship between global coral cover trends and sea temperature. I just wanted to touch quickly on some regional patterns. I know there are 5 presentations after me on regional on the regions, so I won't touch on this in any great detail. But you will see this is the 10 GCRMN regions and the average coral cover presented across roughly the same time periods. And you'll see that there's fairly significant variation in the magnitude of change over time. But you also see, if you kind of stare at it enough, that there are actually similarities in the patterns. So early on, even though data were scarce, particularly very early on, global coral cover was regional coral cover in each of these regions was relatively stable. But you do see the 1998 bleaching signature quite strongly in a number of regions, particularly South Asia. But the other point that you see that's fairly common, despite the magnitude or the different trajectories, is that coral cover does seem to be declining in the last decade across most regions, and that's a fairly common trait. The last slide I wanted to touch on is where to for the GCRMN now that we've managed to produce, to use Penny's word, this monumental report. There are two dimensions to the GCRMN. The first is producing evidence-based scientific information for management and policy and ICRI and the like. The second is building capability and capacity to monitor coral reefs. We learned a lot in the production of this particular report, and Jeremy touched on many aspects of it in terms of the huge variation in the types of data that we received in order to produce this report. Those who've already had a quick look will know or will have already observed that the two things that we really focus on are coral cover and algal cover. They were essentially the two indicators of coral reef health that were recorded in significantly or sufficiently similar ways across the world's different monitoring programs that we could integrate them into a sensible quantitative statistical analysis. We received a lot of fish data, and we are grateful for receiving it, but the data was collected in such a variable way with very different descriptions and taxonomic resolution and the like, that it was impossible to integrate into a global analysis. So this is a key area that we seriously want to enhance for the next report and going forwards, is to achieve this greater interoperability and the adoption of standards for monitoring. The other aspect that we barely report on in this report, to its detriment, is the socioeconomic aspect or the human dimension of coral reefs. They are extremely important, and perhaps one of the consequences of the approach was that we could only qualitatively incorporate socioeconomic information into the report, but we do strongly advocate for stronger socioeconomic monitoring going forwards across the world, because ultimately it's people driving many of these changes. And if we know what people want and how they're impacted by coral reefs and changes in coral reefs, then we're better able to manage coral reefs in addition to people. So we will be focusing on building capability and capacity going forwards. We also recognise that there are an extraordinary number of new technologies to monitor coral reefs and other marine environments, and integrating some of these new technologies with traditional methods will also be one of our priorities. And as always, providing scientifically credible, rigorous monitoring to underpin management of the world's reefs will always be a core goal of the GCRMN. So with that, Penny, I'll hand back to you and the rest of the speakers.
Thank you very much indeed, David. We'll move straight into the regional presentations, and the very first one is from Tadashi Kimura. And Tadashi, we're looking forward to hearing about your region. Tadashi, I should just tell you all, for those of you who don't know him, is a chief researcher of the Japan Wildlife Center, JWRC, and organises the National Monitoring Program of Coral Reefs. But even more importantly, from our perspective, he is a coordinator of the East Asia region on coral reef monitoring and conservation under the GCRMN. Tadashi, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for your warm introduction, Penny. And my name is Tadashi. I'm from Japan Wildlife Research Center, and as Penny explained, I am working as a GCRMN regional coordinator of East Asia, together with Dr. Carrington in Singapore. So I'd like to talk about the brief result of our East Asia region. First of all, I'd like to say congratulations for David, Jeremy, and all the editorial team to complete this report. I think it's a long way to complete the global report since we had a first meeting in Bangkok, I think. So we all appreciate your great effort and patience and enthusiasm. So we are happy to join this event today. So thank you, David and Jeremy, and all the team. So next slide, please. So our East Asia region has 14 countries and states from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia. They are South Korea, Japan, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, Brunei Darussalam, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. So all 11 countries provided mounting data for this analysis, except China, because they are going to produce their own analysis, own status report with their own analysis. So we have data from 11 countries. So thank you very much for all the contributors for providing data. And next slide, please. So this is the summary of the data in East Asia collected from 11 countries. So we have 2,570 sites and a total of 80,382 observations. The longest time series was 26 years monitoring from 1983 to 2019. So with all these data provided, result of coral cover as the next slide. Next slide, please. So this is the estimated regional average coral cover. So quite similar to the global trend. So the solid line represents the estimated mean, and the darker shade is 80% credible intervals, and lighter shade is 95% credible intervals. And the gray area represents periods during which no field data was available. So according to the analysis, coral cover in this region has increased slightly over the last 37 years. But coral cover during the last decades has declined. So this decline equivalent to the loss of almost 11% of the hard corals, because the large scale coral bleaching events seen in 2010 and 2016. So during the last decade, since 1998, global bleaching. So next slide, please. So this is a summary of the result. The coral cover has increased slightly over the last 37 years, but coral cover has declined during the last decades. And that is the loss of almost 11% of the hard corals. So large-scale bleaching events were occurred in 1998, 2010, and 2016. But in 2019, some recovery was observed. So next slide, please. So this is the key message from our region. So from the result of the analysis, we would like to share key message from our region. So we found out that the large-scale coral bleaching events were the greatest disturbance to our region. And for this finding, we urgently need long-term actions to tackle climate change that caused mass coral bleaching. So next, please. And another key message is that however, some recovery was observed in 2019, and this indicates that coral reefs are still resilient if pressure on these critical ecosystems are reduced. So to maintain reef resilience, we emphasize resilience-based management and reduced anthropogenic stress on reefs, such as sedimentation, eutrophication, physical disturbance by development, tourism, and the fisheries, etc. So that is all about the brief result of East Asia region. And if you need more details, please get the whole report. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tadashi. Our next regional report is from the Pacific. And for this, we have the pleasure of the company and expertise of Dr. Serge Plan. Serge is currently director of CRIOB that I mentioned before, with its locations in 2 sites, in Perpignan and in Moorea in French Polynesia. At the national level, Serge works or directs the CORAI LabEx, which brings together all French scientists working on the ecology and related issues of coral reefs. Serge, la parole est à vous.
Thank you very much. I guess you got my screen, and I guess you got everything on mine, and you can hear me. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about what we found out for the Pacific region. This region being a region that accounts for about 26%, so about a fourth of all the coral reef of the world, only in 17 countries, and only, I would say, for an inhabitant of about 13.5 million people, which including 9 people living in Papua New Guinea. So clearly a lot of coral reef spread in clearly what is the largest area in terms of space, and with several thousand islands and a very scattered system compared to most of other coral reef we can find. The region was subdivided for the analysis in 7 sub-regions that you have here, on which you can see immediately that actually the Bismarck Sea, which is region number 2, which is also region number 3, that includes New Caledonia and Vanuatu and Fiji, are clearly the most dominant one in terms of amount of coral reef you can find in the region as well. But you will see, and that's the interest, to have that subdivided in sub-region, to see the interest into showing that the patterns that you're finding in one places may be different than the pattern that you're having. If I look at the number of data that we got from the Pacific, it's 15 of the country out of 17 were involved. The 2 that were not involved are countries that are very remote, such as Niue or places like that. But the number of sites and number of observation, you can see that even a number of observations, it's almost 50% of the entire data set. So clearly it's a region that has been largely monitored, even if it's really scattered through the entire Pacific Ocean. The longest series is 29 years, and the 3 main or dominant type of survey was for the quadrat, line intersect transect, point intersect transect, which are clearly the traditional ones, and about the same frame we can have at the scale of the entire monitoring that we have through the world for the different type of monitoring people are doing. But that leads also to the question about whether those techniques will be the one for the future, and that's something that David touched out, and that we'll have to touch at some stage also in the discussion within the GCRMN with all the partners. Main result, you have on the left side what is about the coral, on the right side what is about the algae. What you can see is that nothing happened until 1998, similar as the global trend. There's a slight decrease in 1998, not as similar as the global trends. And there's a sort of most significant decrease is actually between 2010, more or less, and 2019. And that is actually what is found in the global trend. So the event of the 1998 event was not so dramatic as at the world level, but clearly what's happening since 2010 is actually very similar in the Pacific from what is happening at the global stage. And clearly those drops are linked to major El Nino events. So meaning that those drops are linked to specific sort of sea temperature anomaly that has been already observed at the same level. You can see that on the right side, you've got here the algal sort of cover change through time. Almost no change until 2010, more or less. And then since 2010, a slight increase and a constant increase of algae cover, and reaching basically up to 20%. So an addition of about 6% within just the last 10 years. So I'd say that for the Pacific, it's really the last 10 years that are really critical and are showing main patterns, both of declines of coral reef and both of increase of algae. If we're looking more sort of in detail, and I like to go sometimes into detail because it gives an idea about how variable it can be from one country to another one, how different it can be from one country to another one. So then this is the last slide. It's looking at within the Pacific region, the 7 different sub-regions, and to see how those patterns, and I highlighted on the right side, same again, sorry, on the left side, same again, you've got the hard coral cover. On the right side, you've got the algal cover. And then if I look at the hard coral cover, you can see that some areas, such as, for example, the area number 2, that includes actually Papua New Guinea, for example, that's not much decline. The area number 4, that includes, for example, Hawaii, there's no much decline hard coral cover, but all the other regions are showing some decline, more impressive for some regions, such as region 5, that is the Marshall Islands group, or maybe less in some regions, such as region 1 and 3. So in terms of evolution of the hard coral cover, what the global frame that we're seeing at the Pacific level is really a patchwork of different evolution and different change that you have at the sub-region level. And that sub-region level will be, to me, very important now for regional countries and giving in some ways back this GCRMN report, not only at the global community, not only at the, I would say the UNEP sort of community, but also going back to the countries and the small countries to see what's happening in their country and to help them in some ways to better manage and to better manage with knowledge of what's happening in their country. On the right side, you've got the algae, and more or less the algae are showing same thing, is that you have some region that are showing real big increase, such as region 1 that includes actually all the Mariana and the Micronesia, and also such as region 5 that includes all the Marshall Islands, again, that are showing very strong increase in algae. Again, this is to emphasize that not everything is the same everywhere. In the overall, we've got a decline, but that decline is actually not the same everywhere. And that difference between region will have to take into account when considering management sort of perspective and management issues. So this is what comes out from the Pacific region. Interestingly, of course, is that this what comes out in the Pacific region is in accordance to a recent report that was done about 3 years ago for the Pacific. And so that's the support actually that even an analysis at the global level can be dropped down up to a regional level and give information at the regional level as well. And thanks for the GCRMN for providing all this opportunity. And then thanks, of course, to all the regional provider of all the data that we added in the Pacific. Thank you very much.
Merci, Serge. And we are now moving in a different direction. We're going to the Western Indian Ocean, and we're going to hear from Dr. David Obura. David is the founding director of Cordio East Africa, another acronym that's very well known in the coral reef community. It's a knowledge organization supporting sustainability of coral reef and marine systems in the Western Indian Ocean. And David's primary research is on coral reef resilience, in particular to climate change. David, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Penny. Again, another glowing introduction I'll have to live up to. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to our GCRMN team for getting to this point, because it has been a monumental task, as has been said. thanks to the participants viewing, and I see some of our Western Indian Ocean participants in the list as well. So thanks for coming to this. So I'll give a quick overview of the results that we obtained for the West Indian Ocean in this global report. This builds on quite a lot of regional network activity we've had over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, and from the beginning of the GCRMN with a regional report in 2017, and then a bleaching update that was done in 2018. And that's a bit reflected in the participation that we had of data contributors to the report. So there's 120 authors and contributors in the West Indian Ocean chapter. So I can't go through everybody's name in person. Thank you all for your contributions. Just emphasizing the consistency that we put into this report across the different regions and the graphics that you see over here. I'll just go through some of the background information. So the West Indian Ocean comprises about 6% of the world's coral reefs. So we're not one of the big regions, but we do have beautiful reefs all the way on the western side of the Indian Ocean. We have 10 member countries with both mainland and island states. And in the report and the analysis, we have just under 1,000 sites reported by our teams, 25,000 observations, and the longest time series that we had contributed for this goes back 26 years. You can see that, as in many different regions, the efforts in coral reef monitoring started in the late 80s and the 1990s, really, but really kicked off with a global bleaching event in 1998, which really showed how vulnerable reefs are to human activities. I've shown the methodology graph in the bottom right, mostly to make the point about some of the networking initiatives and structures that we need to set up, is that we use the same methodologies as most other regions in the global report, but our metadata, so our reporting that the type of information that we collect and how is not quite as good as it should be, and the unknown methods is quite high there. So we're quite sure those are line transects and point transects and photoquadrats, just like the other regions. So the main results that we have, so I've shown here the graph of the hard coral cover on the left and the algae cover on the right. And from the data that we had contributed, we can see for the hard corals that the earlier data comes from a sparse number of sites. So the error bars are quite large, and we even have an increase in reported coral cover up to 1998. We feel that's likely due to the selection of sites as more programs started to monitor reefs, of course, in the nice reef areas. The decline in coral cover in 1998, the global bleaching event, is very clear. And then also the recovery after that event over the 10 to 15 years until the next major series of bleaching events. And then from 2010 to 2020, we're showing this consistent decline that is being shown in the global data sets and in other regions as well. By contrast, the fleshy algae and algal cover in the West Indian Ocean has always been quite high. So it's at very similar levels to coral cover, up close to 30% from the beginning of the time series, and then staying around that level with some up and down fluctuations as the coral recovers in the late up to 2010, and then the bleaching events from 2010 onwards. And when we look at the ratio of coral to algae on our reefs, this graph is showing it's relatively stable around 1, increasing slightly with this data set. We have a range of sub-regional results that can be shown. I won't go into them in as much detail as in some of the other regions have done, because of course there's a lot of detail that is hidden in all of this. Where the submission of data that we have for our region is showing this somewhat increase in coral cover. You can see in region 1, which is the mainland East African coast, Tanzania, Kenya, northern Mozambique, which I do feel, having, with experience in the region and the programs that we have, we do feel that's a bit of an artifact of the way reef monitoring is done and starts up, as opposed to showing the impacts that we have felt in the region. We're seeing a decline in region 2, that's the Seychelles Islands. But a good story, an interesting story we have is all the way in the south in region number 5, that's the southern Mozambique and northern South Africa coast. It's a very cool high latitude area for coral reefs, and coral cover is even increasing in that region as temperatures warm slightly. So there may be a good story there in terms of refuges for corals into the future. The algae cover data fluctuates a lot more across some of the subregions, as you can see in the bottom right. But just interpreting these results against other results that we've reported in our network is important. I come back to this graphic on the bottom left showing that 60% of the records from our region come from these one-off surveys, which likely come about through environmental impact assessments or from new studies or student studies that are being done and so on. And the results that we showed of increase in coral cover up to 2010 and then the stable algae cover don't correspond to what we reported in 2017, but that's likely because in the 2017 report, we only used data from time series with 4 time points or more, so that we wouldn't have this bias of the one-off shots. And there we can see this decline in coral cover from 1998 and increase in algae cover from 1998 as well. And so one of the tasks that we'll do now, having completed this global report, is to really look at the analytical approaches that we use in these 2 different processes and try and align them and see what the latest data says about the last 3 or 4 years compared to before 2016, our last bleaching event. So this brings up many of the regional observing network issues that we have to work on in the GCRMN. This is a common issue to global observing networks, so both ocean observing networks, which are coordinated through UNESCO under the Global Ocean Observing System, as well as other biodiversity observing networks under GEOBON around submission of data, data quality control, and then the spatial and temporal representation that you have in the data sets. So in conclusion, we certainly show in this reporting that the largest coral bleaching events in 1998 and 2016 had major impacts on the coral community in the Western Indian Ocean, and some minor ones around 2010 and after 2010. Coral algal trends are tending to decline overall in terms of reef health. And in looking at these graphs, we need to look at these short periods for the most robust interpretation. So either the last 10 years or the trends in coral cover around the major bleaching events. We certainly need to increase investment in monitoring, particularly in sites with 2 to 5 and 6 to 10 year time series to continue those into the long term and to strengthen the methodologies and consistency and improve the metadata that we report. And we'll update our regional report. As I said, we wrote it in 2017, so 2022 next year is perhaps a good time point for a 5-year update of that. And then on a final postscript, I'll add that we've also completed the red list of ecosystems in the Western Indian Ocean using this data set from the GCRMN. And we assessed the region's reefs to be vulnerable to collapse and some ecoregions to be from vulnerable to endangered or critically endangered. And this is under final review now, so I can't share the full results. But the method is established to replicate this approach throughout the GCRMN regions with the data from this report. So we're really looking to implementing that, looking for partners to extend this globally over the next few years. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. We'll look forward to getting the updates when you've got more to deliver on the last comments. Our next presentation goes back to a totally different region, another part of the world in the Caribbean, and we're going to hear from Dr. Sandrine Pivard. Sandrine is Director of the Specially Protected Areas and Wildlife Regional Activity Centre, which is dedicated to the biodiversity program of the Cartagena Convention. It's an international organisation hosted by France in support of the UN Programme for Environment, Caribbean Environment Programme. Sandrine is also, especially for us, the regional coordinator of the GCRMN Caribbean node. Sandrine, over to you.
Okay, can you hear me, see me? And
yes,
see
we can.
Thank you.
Allez-y.
Just trying, so it's okay like this. So thank you very much, Vinny. I would like to thank you for giving me the.
We've lost your sound, Sandrine. Frozen.
Especially the steering committee that got extremely involved in the chapter. So as for the background of the Caribbean region, ecologically it's characterized by the low coral reef species, at least for the seeable one, because we know we have a high level of cryptic species. We have also a high level of endemism. We have 70% of the population that live near coast and depends directly from marine resources. So which means that coral reef are, as in other region, but it's strong for Caribbean, vital for people through fishing, tourism, but also coastal resilience. And it's a very diverse region with more than 30 countries, 25 that got involved in the report, 16 overseas territories, so with a considerable variation of economical capacity. And as David shown, also we have a lot of people involved in the chapter. Regarding the trends, first the monitoring, sorry, we have about 200,000 observations, so about 10% of the overall observation, 7,000 surveys and 300,000 sites. Data were scarce prior to the 90s, but it got very important for the last 10 years. Yes, the more than 25 last years. The majority of the sites were surveyed only once, but we have 10% of the sites that have long monitored period. And the longest is 30 years, almost 30 years. As for the coverage of coral reef, we have an average hard coral cover at the regional scale that showed a decline between 83 and now, and particularly since the end of the 90s, where confidence in the estimate of average cover was much greater. We expected it to be even steeper, according to all the observation. And it would have been if we had included the earlier period from the 17th. As you've seen from the Jackson report that we had a very intense decline at that period. Nevertheless, we've lost 10% of the coral over the last 2 decades, and of course, as in the other region, it declined, and it had some alternating period of decline and recovery. It depends also of the sub-region, but overall, and especially we've seen that for the long-term monitoring sites, we've lost a very significant part of the coral reef, and most of those sites are yet to recover. If we go, I won't have time to go in detail for the trend, and I think I've gone to Alga there. You see that we have some sub-region with a strong decline. We have one region with a slight increase. As it happened, it's the Greater Antilles, and it has a larger area in kilometers. It tends to wait on the analysis, but overall we can see that decline, and we can see also, in particular, in some region 1, so in the north of the Caribbean, as much as the events, all of the 98 and the 2005 events had strong effect and they have yet to recover for at least 3 of the subregion. As for the alga, it shows the inverse trend. It's even stronger than in the other region of the world. The increase is particularly significant. Again, with variation between subregion, but it's really significant for most of the subregion. I'm going quick because I don't want to take too much time, and I really want to pass the key message from the network and from the steering committee. So the first key message is that that regional data chapter, all those new data confirm that live hard coral and alga corals are experiencing reverse trajectories, and that we tend to have an acceleration of those trends in some of the subregion, even if as I've shown, it can be nuanced by some others. We would like to point out also that overexploitation of fish, heavy development of coastal areas, chronic coastal water pollution, more frequent and intense coral bleaching events, stronger hurricanes, which we undergone a lot in the region recently, and what we call the more recent threats as lionfish sargassum influx and the new disease SCTLD. Tend to have a strong effect on the global trend, and in particular the increase in the frequency and intensity of those disturbances make that they don't recover. Most of the coral or some of the coral can't recover for those patterns anymore. So as a recommendation, we of course, something very common with other region, we strongly recommend to reduce runoff in coastal area, ship discharge, to take special attention to ballast water, as we have it brings also the question of the lionfish in the region, to have a very careful attention to fish populations and diadema populations for enforce their protection and help for replenish their zone, and in particular we have attention on parrotfish, where we recommend as the GCRMN network to reduce their catch and ban it for the bigger species, and also to reduce or ban the use of destructive gear. And I think that's the last one. We also call, but Serge, you already integrated that very well, call for a more holistic approach next time. And so we call for starting to organize the data already. In particular, in the region, we are very committed to the socioeconomic monitoring, which we consider as essential for the human dimension of coral reef. And it should not stand alone, and it should be completely integral to the collection on physical condition, because it's critical to understand fully what happened, and also it's critical for the success of conservation and management. And we have the same recommendation for including more benthic fish data, also for the same reason, because we have very good hunch that in the region, some of the region that could do better, or at least we know we have some very good results, especially in the Mesoamerica of zone, where they are banning or they are reducing the catch of fish, and we would like to encourage this, as ICRI has done already, tries through recommendation as well. So I thank you, and I hand over again, thank again everybody, and I hand over to the next region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandrine, for another rich report and particularly useful recommendations. I think our final presenter in these regional snapshots is David Suter. I've already introduced David, who's going to be speaking about the situation in Australia. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Penny. I'll just wait for Sandrine to...
Yes, I'm trying. Yeah. I'm trying. Sorry. I think it's okay.
Yep, thank you.
It's good.
All right. Okay, very quickly on the Australian region, just to provide you with some context, some of Australia's reefs, as everyone I think would appreciate, are genuinely iconic. The Great Barrier Reef on the east coast and the Ningaloo Reef on the west coast. I've got to say, as an Australian living in Townsville, that it is makes me very proud to have an ecosystem as rich and valuable as the Great Barrier Reef on my doorstep. And as a relatively recent Australian, you can imagine that the cultural significance of our coastal reefs in Australia to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is enormously significant as well. Our reefs are very economically significant. The GBR alone contributes $6.4 billion to Australia's economy and employs some 64,000 people in tourism, fishing, recreation and research. One of the things about Australia is that it's a region that has very highly developed management and policy frameworks. I think it's worth acknowledging our chair for the session, Penny Wensley, who's in fact not only the chair of AIMS, but also the chair of the Reef Advisory Committee, which is responsible for providing valuable advice on the implementation of Australia's 2050 long-term sustainability plan, which essentially is the Australian and Queensland government's framework for ensuring the long-term sustainability of the Great Barrier Reef. The other aspect about Australian reefs worth highlighting, I think, is that there is significant investment in Australia's coral reefs, particularly in management of crown of thorns starfish, in water quality, and more recently in reef restoration and adaptation programs. And I think this needs to be recognised and encouraged, and in fact would lead to coordination globally. So monitoring in Australia began in 1985, largely focused on trying to figure out the distribution and abundance of crown of thorns starfish, which was a problem at the time. At that time, we used manta toes, which, for those who aren't aware, is essentially dragging a diver behind a boat, and they count coral fish, crown of thorns starfish, and other target species. However, the data that we've used in this particular report are in fact photo transect or photo quadrat data. So the data have been extracted from photographs taken on reefs both on the east and west coast. These data are critical to understanding the status and trends, and in addition, understanding the effectiveness of management of our reef ecosystems. The volume of data that we've accumulated in Australia is substantial, both on the east and west coasts, and I think it's worth acknowledging the significant data contributors from both sides of the country. Some 97,000 observations from 3,000 or more than 3,800 surveys at 372 sites. Unfortunately, we didn't receive any data from Lord Howe Island, so that's not included in this particular analysis. But there are two things or two characteristics of Australian monitoring that are worth highlighting. The first is, if you look at figure A, there is a considerable proportion of sites that we revisit over and over again. So our long-term monitoring programs are focused on revisiting the same sites, which is excellent for determining change over time and trends and status within these reefs. The second element that's worth highlighting is that the commitment to monitoring by Australia, the Australian government, has been substantial. So the AIMS long-term monitoring program, the particular version with using photo quadrats, was started in 1994, and it's been sustained throughout that time. So that level of commitment is strong within Australia. So the trends of coral cover on Australian reefs, remembering that this is the combined average across all of the 3 subregions that we receive data from. Very similar patterns to...
David, sorry. We can't see slides if you were meaning to be sharing your screen.
Yes, so I can see mine. Oh, that's embarrassing.
Sorry.
Thank you. I feel like that's half the presentation gone. My apologies, everyone. How about now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see
but
that
not
now.
in presenter mode. Yep. Okay. Right-ho, I will not go backwards. I will just continue on from where I was. So look, the trends in Australian coral reefs are somewhat similar initially to the global pattern and to some of the other regions that have been presented before me. Relatively high coral cover and relatively stable. However, what we see on the Great Barrier Reef and in Western Australia is the influence of coral bleaching, 1998 and 2002. So 1998 had quite a significant influence on Western Australian reefs in particular, less so on the Great Barrier Reef, but 2002 had quite an influence on Australia's Great Barrier Reef. Between 2004 and 2007, there were little disturbances and a period of recovery. However, between 2008 and 2014, we saw quite significant impacts from a range of different factors. On the Great Barrier Reef, we saw the influence of massive tropical cyclones, Hamish and Yasi, the outbreak of a crown of thorns starfish population, and significant bleaching in Western Australia. And this caused substantial declines in coral cover. There's a brief period of recovery, and then we have the massive 2016-2017 back-to-back bleaching event. That 2016 event in particular affected the northern end of the Great Barrier Reef and the northern reefs of Western Australia. And then we had another very significant bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef in 2017, which affected the central Great Barrier Reef. As a consequence of those 2 bleaching events, what we've seen is the Great Barrier Reef has been affected by bleaching. 2/3 of it has been affected by bleaching in those two events, causing significant decline. But what we are seeing is the first signs of recovery. And in fact, those of you who will have seen the release of the latest AIMS long-term monitoring report will actually know that the recovery seen particularly on the Great Barrier Reef does extend beyond these 2019 data. So these are positive signs for the Barrier Reef, showing that it is certainly still resilient. And I think the same can be said for Western Australian reefs as well. So algae cover is essentially the inverse of coral cover. You'll see that every time we had a major impact or disturbance on Australian reefs, we had an increase in the cover of algae, and when coral cover recovers, we get a concomitant decline in algae. But really the main point with algal populations on the reef is that it's almost doubled the amount of algae on Australian reefs in the last decade. So just quickly, finally, to give you an understanding of the different patterns in Australian reefs from the east coast on the Great Barrier Reef, the west coast and Cocos Keeling Islands. We have very few data received from the Cocos Keeling Islands and very small reef area, so exerts quite a small influence on the overall Australian pattern. You'll see there that the Great Barrier Reef constitutes almost 85% of all Australian reefs. So essentially the Australian status and trends graphs, the regional average is largely driven by what's going on in the Great Barrier Reef. But I would like to highlight a couple of things with Western Australia. On average, the coral cover on West Australian reefs is actually higher. And the other point to note is that the monitoring in Western Australia reefs, while there is significant commitment in some areas, there is an element, I guess, of sporadic monitoring elsewhere or opportunistic monitoring. And that's why you see these grey areas in the graph. So my apologies for the technical difficulties. I'll hand back to you, Penny, for closing comments, and thanks.
Thank you very much, David. And yes, apologies that we missed out on the first few of the slides, but the descriptions were good and we could imagine, so thank you. We now have a short time for questions. There are quite a few. We won't get through them all because we're running slightly over time, but I do want to take a couple of them. A couple of them I think are quite straightforward. There's one practical question from Ruleo Camacho saying that on the GCRMN site, there's no link to a Caribbean chapter. Is there a reason for this?
Indeed, there is, and
yes.
The reason is that the Caribbean chapter is under review by the Caribbean Steering Committee, and we will upload it as soon as it is ready, which we anticipate to be within the very near future.
Terrific. There's another question from Japan, Tanaka Iji, who comments that the Ministry of the Environment of Japan has been supporting the activities of GCRMN in East Asia. And he asked particularly, how will the results of the World Report, the new status report, going to be inputted to the current negotiation of developing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework? And in the previous session, with the handover from one set of chairs to the next chairmanship, this was addressed, I believe. So I might ask someone from the Secretariat who could, or well, whoever wants to comment about linking the results of the World Report to the next setting of the framework for biodiversity. David, do you want to do that, or do you want to pass it on to someone who was working on that subcommittee?
My inclination is to pass that on to Emily Corcoran, who led that particular subcommittee, but I am absolutely happy to chime in.
I don't know whether she's still on. Oh, Emily, you're there.
Indeed.
Hello.
Hi, I'm in the background here. Hi.
You can star again.
This is a really excellent question, and I think we've been really looking forward to seeing this report because it demonstrates many of the indicators that ICRI has recommended for inclusion in the global biodiversity framework and in the monitoring framework. So in response to AG's question, we will be working hard now to use the results to help demonstrate the importance of including these indicators. And we'll be doing that work along with the ad hoc committee, which of course AG is a very active member of. So we'll be taking that work forward and looking forward to being able to give some clear demonstrations that these are indicators that are available. They tell important stories and can also hold us accountable in the commitments that we make under the new framework.
Thank you very much, Emily. And I have another practical one from another Sandrine Job. During the Bangkok meeting, apparently those attending discussed the opportunity to share regularly data for the next GCRMN report in a common database. And Sandrine asks, is this still relevant today?
I'm happy to answer that, Penny.
Thank you, David. It's good when you jump in.
The answer is an unequivocal yes. However, it does need to be moderated slightly in the fact that one thing that is important about the data that were provided for this particular report is that they were all provided under a data sharing agreement, and almost invariably the conditions of that agreement were that the data were going to be used for this report as the sole purpose. So any additional use for other purposes required the permission of the custodian. Now, I think we are seeing a cultural shift, and certainly one of the great advantages and indeed, and by the same token, challenges, is being able to capitalize on the enormous amount of work that's gone into accumulating this data set. We obviously remain true to the data sharing agreement, but as I highlighted in the global presentation, enhancing data interoperability, sharing, and reuse is one of the things that the GCRMN really wants to do going forwards. David Obura also highlighted in his presentation the role that GCRMN can play as a global observing network as well. So data sharing in the future will be important, and we need to facilitate that process going forwards.
Thanks very much, David. There's another one here that I think maybe Serge might be able to answer from Erwin Sola. Seems that no decline in hardcover coral was seen in East Pacific after the 1998 bleaching. Is this right? And if so, what do you think explains this, as well as the clear peak increase in HC cover until 2010? Could it be due to conditions becoming more favourable for coral development at higher latitudes in recent times? Serge, would you like to have a try at that one? Multiple questions.
I'm sure Serge would like to, but he's currently doing an interview for the report. So I'm so sorry about that. Yeah. But maybe David or one of the David could reply to this. Apologize for on behalf of Serge.
This is true. So I'm happy to provide a bit of an answer, and certainly David Obura can chime in. While the 98 event certainly was a global event, the impacts of the 98 event did vary from region to region slightly. I think and this is really where David's expertise and those in South Asia really have the knowledge here, in that the Indian Ocean was particularly badly affected in 1998, whereas the Pacific, and as we saw from Tadashi's presentation, was affected but less affected. So we do have a regional variation across the reef-bearing areas of the world.
David Obura, did you want to add to that?
Sorry, I won't add a lot, as I don't have the local knowledge for the Eastern Pacific, but it also might be not that it's a high latitude region, but there's a lot of upwelling there, and the waters are cooler around the Eastern tropical Pacific, and so it might have been less impacted then.
Thank you. The questions are pouring in, but we're going to have to call it to a close fairly soon, because I'm conscious we're already over time. I have, let's have just a couple more. The one from Aldo Croca from the Nature Conservancy Caribbean, asking, did you find a clear linear relationship between coral cover decline and increase of macroalgae as before? Or is the relationship not quite as simple as we previously thought? Well, we might go back and have a look at the animation again and see whether that helps us.
There is a Sandrine as the appropriate person.
Yes, I'm just looking to see whether Sandrine is still with us.
It's also very early in the morning for Sandrine.
I think Sandrine left also. So again, I'm sorry. So maybe one of the Davids. Thank you.
So David
happy to give it a quick crack. We'd have to look quite specifically at the Caribbean to determine whether there was essentially a linear relationship, as you mentioned, Aldo. But if we look at what has happened in a number of regions, and certainly the globe, there is a very strong relationship between declines in coral cover and increases in algae, and we see that in the global ratio of coral to algae.
Okay, and we have another one from Sebastian Zerade. Live hard coral cover has been often recognised to be a surface level indicator, as increases and/or decreases don't necessarily reflect reef functionality. In particular, a fast recovery can be due to weedy species that don't support reef functionality. Does the GCRMN intend to address this element of reef monitoring in the future?
I can take that one if you like, David, just to let you off the hook.
Just a bit of variation, someone else's voice.
It's such a good question.
David Obura.
Yeah. It's something we already deal with in the GCRMN, and that's because of the variety of monitoring programs around the world, we've identified a tiered approach to collecting the data. So hard coral cover, we call it a level 1 variable, but at levels 2 or 3, you can identify functional groups or genera within that. But the challenge we had, as Jeremy presented in the first presentation on the data processing, is that the variation in how different groups collect that data and to what degree of reliability and accuracy is so high that we're not able to analyze that in the global reporting process. You'll see that in some of the regional reports, the GCRM networks can do it more effectively because of greater consistency at their levels. But yes, it's a big intent is that we improve this process so that the next global report can include that amount of detail.
Thank you. Well, I'll make the next one the last question because we're already over the hour and there are people having to go to other commitments. But there's a question from Antoine Gilbert. David and Serge underline the need of data greater interoperability and the integration of new technologies with traditional ones. This may be taking us in the direction of next steps, which is what we all should be thinking about. But he asks in particular, can you give a little more detail on those issues and in particular how the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network and ICRI will provide help to the regional and local levels in these areas?
So
David Obura first. Oh no, David Suter.
No. David
I have a
Obura.
plethora of Davids.
Too many Davids as always.
Okay, I'll give it a quick shot, and then David Suter can give perhaps the final response. But this is also part of the new approach. So under the GCRMN, just prior to this global report, we've been undergoing a revitalization, and we developed an implementation governance plan. And under that, we identified or followed the global practice now, which is rather than focusing on the method for how you collect data, so underwater visual census in most cases right now, is to focus on the variables, such as coral cover. And you can collect that variable with many different tools. So we're really going to try and focus on what tools collect the variable in comparable ways. And then within regional networks, really try and work on this capacity building and building strengths and capabilities to be able to use new tools and combine them together. So it'll be a challenge, but it's on our next order of work. David.
Okay. Thank you very much. David Suter, did you want to add to that, or
just quickly to say that there are a number of initiatives ongoing that are very collaborative initiatives that are looking to use technologies to overcome some of the capability and capacity gaps. To one of the challenges while building capability and capacity within the regions, particularly at a local level, is certainly something that we would attempt to do through running workshops and the like in a post-COVID world. We can also introduce technologies to get around some of those capability and capacity gaps, whereby one doesn't have to be a highly knowledgeable coral taxonomists to be able to identify species while undertaking transects and the like. So there are a number of collaborative initiatives that are going on at this moment to help generate rigorous scientific coral reef monitoring data without necessarily the need to be a PhD in coral reef ecology, but still the quality of the data is eminently usable for rigorous management and policy development.
Thank you very much, David. Well, my apologies to those who have posted questions on the Q&A and we haven't been able to deal with them. They've been flooding in, but I assure you, you will receive a response to your questions or comments by email. Thank you, everybody, for your interest and for committing the time to join us for this very important launch. For some of you, the hour is still very early. For others, it's quite late. But it was absolutely worth it. I'm certain if together we can use this report and act on its recommendations and the information that it provides to ensure that it is not too late to save the world's coral reefs and related ecosystems. I'd like to wish the United States incoming chairmanship every success under the leadership of Monica Medina. I'm delighted that she has returned to this field. I thank the outgoing triple chairs for the fantastic work that's been achieved under your leadership and guidance. I thank all the presenters and everyone who made the arrangements for this online meeting, and particularly the ICRI Secretariat. And I bid you all a pleasant morning, afternoon, evening, from wherever you have joined us. Bonne matinée, bon après-midi, bonsoir, ou pour ceux qui veulent fêter l'occasion, bonne soirée et bonne célébration.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, all.
All right.